But there's an awful lot in these chapters that really, as we live in these last days, these latter days, we ought to be trying to get our heads round, and that's the purpose of this series. So let's start off, because we've got the shortest chapter tonight, with just an overview of what is actually in these 5 chapters. So chapter 35, as we've seen, is against Mt Seir and Idumea, and we'll hopefully identify those as we proceed. Chapter 36 is a prophecy unto, not against, but unto the mountains of Israel. And chapter 36 talks about, first of all, the physical and then the spiritual restoration of Israel. So 36 verse 24, I will take you from among the heathen and gather you out of the countries and will bring you into your own land. And then verse 25, I'll sprinkle clean water upon you. Verse 26, a new heart. Verse 27, I will put my spirit within you. Verse 28, you shall dwell in the land and I will be your God. So we've got the physical restoration of the people to the land, and then their spiritual restoration to their God. Then in chapter 37 we've got the fairly well-known prophecy of the valley of dry bones, followed on by the parable of the 2 sticks, and then the appearance of their king in verse 22, and finally, in the last verses of the chapter, the establishment of God's sanctuary in the midst of them. Then in chapter 38, of course, we've got the invasion of Gog and his allies, and in the latter part of the chapter, the destruction of Gog by the power of God. And chapter 39, the utter and total defeat of Gog, the burying of all the hosts of Gog in the valley of Hamon Gog. And at the end of chapter 39, the complete restoration to divine favour of the people of Israel. Last verse of chapter 39, neither will I hide my face any more from them, for I have poured out my spirit upon the house of Israel, saith the Lord Yahweh. So there's our overview of these chapters. Now, the question is, how do we view this series of prophecies, these 5 chapters? Are they, for example, a chronological sequence of events? So we start off with the judgment on Mt Seir, beginning of chapter 35, and we end up with the complete restoration of Israel at the end of chapter 39. That's been seriously proposed within our community, that these chapters are a chronological sequence. But if they're not, then how do they relate to one another? That's one of the issues that we need to tackle as we look at this group of chapters as a whole. So let's pick up a phrase that Brother Peter mentioned in his prayer that occurs in these chapters. So, first of all, Ezekiel 35 verse 4. This is against Mt Seir, and later on we're going to find out who Mt Seir is, hopefully. But just take verse 4. I will lay thy cities waste, and thou shalt be desolate, and thou shalt know that I am Yahweh. So Mt Seir, whoever Mt Seir is going to know that he is Yahweh. Then, chapter 35 verse 15. As thou didst rejoice at the inheritance of the house of Israel because it was desolate, so will I do unto thee. Thou shalt be desolate, O Mt Seir, and all Idumea, even all of it, and they shall know that I am Yahweh. Now is that all the people that are left after the destruction in Mt Seir and Idumea, or is that actually a wider audience? They shall know. Outside of the territory of Mt Seir and Idumea, they shall know that I am Yahweh. Well, look at chapter 36, verse 23. And incidentally, chapter 36, verse 5 mentions Idumea. But chapter 36, verse 23, and I will sanctify my great name, which was profaned among the heathen, which ye have profaned in the midst of them, and the heathen shall know that I am Yahweh, saith the Lord Yahweh, when I shall be sanctified in you, Israel, before their eyes. So when God is sanctified in Israel, the heathen, the nations, know that he is Yahweh. Chapter 37, verse 28, right at the end of the chapter, when the sanctuary is set in the midst of Israel, then 37 verse 28, the heathen shall know that I, Yahweh, do sanctify Israel when my sanctuary shall be in the midst of them for evermore. So again, we've got the heathen knowing that it is Yahweh who has done all of this. Chapter 38 and verse 23, right at the very end now of the prophecy of the destruction of Gog's hosts. Thus will I magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am Yahweh. And finally in chapter 39 and verse 7, so will I make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel. I will not let them pollute my holy name any more, and the heathen shall know that I am Yahweh, the Holy One in Israel. So we see that same phraseology coming out in each one of these 5 chapters. So what is this describing? Well, I believe it's describing the climax of the events that are prophesied in these 5 chapters. It all leads up to this, that the heathen know that it is Yahweh, the God of Israel, who has done all these things. And of course other prophecies like Isaiah 2 tell us that those very same nations will go up to Jerusalem to learn of Yahweh's ways and walk in them. So really the heathen shall know that I am Yahweh is the climax to which all these things are working toward. And yet the phrase occurs in every chapter. So does the climax occur 5 times? Do the heathen know that he is Yahweh and then forget it and then learn it again and again? And clearly not. It is a climax to which all of these chapters are pointing. Now that's a very strong argument against these chapters being a chronological sequence. But let's have a look at 1 or 2 more. 36 we've already seen as we looked at it briefly, and it'll be in more detail in a couple of weeks. It's about the physical and spiritual restoration of, that should be, I corrected that and got it wrong. Physical and spiritual restoration of, ignore the 2, the whole nation of Israel. And they're called at the end of chapter 36, the holy flock. Right? In chapter 37, they're described, the whole house of Israel, as a collection of bones, dry bones in a valley. And they're so dry that the question is asked, can these bones live? So those 2 chapters can't be a chronological sequence. You cannot have Israel fully restored to divine favour and then become a heap of dry bones. Chapter 37 and 38. Chapter 37, as we've seen, ends with the building of God's sanctuary, his tabernacle, in the midst of Israel, which is the millennial temple, which is described in chapters 40 to 48. But chapter 38 describes the occurrence of the greatest earthquake the world has ever seen, which causes every wall to fall to the ground. Now, I was having a discussion with a brother a few days ago as to whether it's every wall in Israel or every wall in the world. But it's certainly every wall in Israel. So does that include the walls of the temple that's just been built? Clearly not. So the earthquake of Ezekiel 38 cannot take place after the building of the temple. Must be before. So what we do actually, and we may come to this later, is we can slide Ezekiel 38 and 39 back into chapter 37. They occur within the chronological pattern of chapter 37, which starts off with Israel as dry bones and finishes up with God's sanctuary in the midst of them. And somewhere in the middle of there, and I'm not going to identify it, I know where I think it is, but we'll leave it to Brother Nathan, who's doing chapter 37. Somewhere within there fits chapters 38 and 39. Now, if you do that, if you in effect slide Ezekiel 38 and 39 back into the middle of 37, 37 ends up with verse 27, my tabernacle also shall be with them, I will be their God and they shall be my people. And the next section in Israel describes describes that sanctuary, chapters 40 to 48, and the priesthood that's going to serve in it, and the sacrifices that will be offered, and so forth. So it all fits together. So I believe that these 5 chapters are in fact all different aspects of the outworking purpose of God in the latter days, all leading up to the same great climax, that the heathen know that he is Yahweh. There are a series of visions depicting different aspects, but leading to the same point. So let's now go back to chapter 35 and start investigating this particular vision that God gave to Ezekiel. Now, it's against, as we've seen, Mt Seir. Interesting, Mt Seir is a geographic reference rather than a demographic reference. So it refers to territory rather than people. It's a mountain. And also we've got at the end of the chapter, all Idumea. So we need to investigate that. So if we look first of all at the word Edom, it comes from Adam, and it has reference to the colour red. And we remember that when Esau was born, he was red all over. And that word is translated 87 times as Edom, 9 times as Edomites, and 4 times as Idumea. And 2 of those occurrences of Idumea occur in chapter 35, verse 15, as we have read, and also in chapter 36. So that's 2 out of the 4. But it is the normal word that's used and is translated as Edom. So it's the people who are descended from Esau. And Genesis 36 verse 8 says, Esau is Edom. So this prophecy, therefore, in its mention of Idumea, is against Edom. It's against the people of Esau. What about Mt Seir? Well, Mt Seir, the Hebrew word is Seir, and it comes from a root which means something which is shaggy, hairy, as an he-goat. And remember also that when Esau was born, he was red all over like a hairy garment. And therefore his name was called Esau. And the root word is translated 28 times as kid and 24 times as goat, and twice as hairy. And those 2 occurrences occur in Genesis 27 verses 11 and 23 when it's describing the man Esau. He's a goat man. He looks like a goat. He is so hairy. So that's the root word. And then the word Seir is translated Seir 39 times. And Deuteronomy 2 verse 5 says, I have given Mount Seir unto Esau. So it's the territory that God gave to the descendants of Esau. That's the territory that this prophecy in Ezekiel 35 is against. So what do we know about Esau and the Edomites who descended from him? Well, we know from Genesis 27, Esau hated Jacob. And that hatred continued through successive generations. The Edomites threatened Israel as they journeyed to the land. They wanted to pass through the land of Edom. They said, if we drink water, we'll pay for it. If we eat anything, we'll pay for it. And the king of Edom said, no, you're not coming through my land. And he came out with force to prevent them from journeying through his land. And the Edomites, in successive generations throughout the history of Israel, played the role of really the pack of hyenas that follows the lion. Turn to the Prophecy of Obadiah, which is probably the best illustration of it. Prophecy of Obadiah is specifically against Edom. The vision of Obadiah, thus saith the Lord Yahweh concerning Edom. And if we look in Obadiah, verse 10, for thy violence against thy brother Jacob, shame shall cover thee, thou shalt be cut off forever. In the day that thou stoodest on the other side, in the day that the strangers carried away captive his forces, and foreigners entered into his gates, and cast lots upon Jerusalem, thou wast as one of them. Thou shouldest not have looked on the day of thy brother, in the day that he became a stranger. Neither shouldest thou have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction. Neither shouldest thou have spoken proudly in the day of their distress. Thou shouldest not have entered into the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Thou shouldest not have looked on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor have laid hands on their substance in the day of thy calamity. Neither shouldest thou have stood in the crossway to cut off those of his that did escape. Neither shouldest thou have delivered up those of his that did remain in the day of distress. So that's the role of Edom. They're like a pack of hyenas. The lions made his kill, and they're in there for the pickings. So whether the lion was the Philistines, as it was in one case, or the Babylonians, as it was in another case, who came against Israel, there were the Edomites, harrying and spoiling and causing trouble. But finally, the Jews got the upper hand. And John Hyrcanus, who was the high priest of Israel between 134 BC and 104 BC, who was also a warrior, led the Jews down into the territory of Mt Seir and Idumea and subdued them, and in effect forced them to live as Jews, made them circumcise and obey the laws of the Jews. And after that, really, Edom just disappears from the pages of history. It became totally desolate. And that's all that's left. There's the ruins of Petra. There are no hotels there. Tourists are bussed in and bussed out. You can't stay overnight at Petra. You just go in, have a look at the ruins, and out again. But although ancient Edom has gone, and the people are no longer there, and the land is desolate, there is a latter-day Edom power. No doubt about that at all. Let's go to our chapter, Ezekiel 35, verse 5. Because thou hast had a perpetual hatred, and hast shed the blood of the children of Israel by the force of the sword, in the time of their calamity, in the time that their iniquity had an end. So this is pointing forward to the latter days. Verse 9. I will make thee perpetual desolations. Thy city shall not return, and ye shall know that I am Yahweh. Because thou hast said, these two nations and these two countries shall be mine, and we will possess it. Whereas Yahweh was there. Therefore, as I live, saith the Lord Yahweh, I will even do according to thine anger, and according to thy envy, which thou hast used out of thy hatred against them. And I will make myself known among them when I have judged thee. So again, it's pointing forward to the restoration of Israel to divine favour, which comes after the judgment of Edom. So verse 14. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, when the whole earth rejoiceth, that's the kingdom, I will make thee desolate. As thou didst rejoice at the inheritance of the house of Israel, because it was desolate, so will I do unto thee. Thou shalt be desolate, O Mount Seir, and all Idumea. So that's Ezekiel 35. Ezekiel 36, prophecy unto the mountains of Israel. And in verse 3, they have been made desolate and swallowed up on every side, that they might be a possession unto the residue of the heathen. God makes this prophecy. Verse 5, therefore, thus saith the Lord Yahweh, surely in the fire of my jealousy have I spoken against the residue of the heathen and against all Idumea. So they're singled out amongst the residue of the heathen, which have appointed my land to their possession, with the joy of all their heart, with despiteful minds to cast it out for a prey. So Ezekiel's told to prophesy unto the mountains of Israel, because all the house of Israel, phrase that occurs in chapter 37 in relation to the valley of dry bones, they're all going to come and it's going to be inhabited, and as we've seen, Israel's restored. So that's Ezekiel 36. Obadiah continues in the same vein, showing that there is a latter day aspect to Edom, and we'll come back to Obadiah later. And Joel 3, which we'll also look at later, clearly says there's going to be an Edom in the latter days. But of course the question is, who is it? Now look at the map of the Middle East, and there are the countries we know well, and Syria, which is mentioned in Bible in scriptural terms, is there. Lebanon, which is in the scriptures, is there, as is Egypt. All those countries are there. Israel, of course, is there now. But search as you may, there is no Edom. It just isn't there. There is no separate identity which we can say, no, it's Edom. There it is. So the question arises then, who is the latter day Edom? Well, Brother Thomas, followed by Brother H.P. Mansfield, suggests that Edom becomes an aggregate name for all the anti-Semitic Gentile nations which defeat Israel at the time of the end. And to support that, they quote Acts chapter 15, where James, we're not going to look at it, but James, by the Spirit, quotes from Amos a passage which refers to Edom, and James applies it to all the heathen. So in Eureka Volume 1 we read, Edom in the latter days is representative of the enemies of Jacob, banded together under Gog, who is then chief of the house of Esau. Now, I think in the time when Brother Thomas lived, when the whole of that area of the Middle East was Ottoman Empire, and there were no separate states, there were no boundaries, there were no borders, it was all Ottoman Empire, I think he made a very good fist of it. And his suggestion at the time had some validity. But of course, we've moved on quite a bit now from that time. We've seen a lot of history take place. So that's one view. There's another view, Harry Whittaker, Duncan Heister, part of 10 Arab nation group which defeats Israel at the time of the end. And in support of that they quote Psalm 83 and Daniel chapter 2. Well, if you look at Psalm 83, which we haven't got time to do tonight, Psalm 83 ends up with the victory of Yahweh over this group who say, let's dispossess Israel. It doesn't end up with the victory of these nations at all, and they're not all Arab nations in the list. They're not even all Semitic nations. Some of them are descended from Japheth. So really that concept of Psalm 83 doesn't work at all. And Daniel chapter 2, well, that's on the supposition that the 10 toes of Daniel chapter 2 are 10 Arab nations, which is, as far as I'm concerned, scripturally not proven. So, who is the latter-day Edom? There's our problem. So there's the Ottoman Empire, and that's the extent of it, the darker colour, in 1914. And we want to focus now on two Bible passages which specifically identify Edom in a particular territory at the time of the end. The first of them is Daniel chapter 11 and verse 40. So let's go there. And I believe these two passages are key to our understanding of who is the latter-day Edom. So let's just read through and take ourselves pictorially through the events of Daniel 11 verse 40. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south, of course, in terms of Daniel 11, is the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. And in 1914, the power in Egypt was the British power. The Egyptian Expeditionary Force of the British Army, commanded eventually by General Edmund Allenby, was there in Egypt. And Allenby pushed up into the Holy Land, and he drove the Turks out of the land. And Britain took over and took the mandate for the land. And the Turks were expelled, and the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and all that is left today is the secular state of Turkey. So that's the first bit. At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. And then the king of the north, and there he is, now no longer the hammer and sickle, that's the current Russian flag. The king of the north shall come against him. And of course the him in this case is Constantinople, which the Russians want to take back. Take back Saint Sophia, Hagia Sophia, and restore the chief basilica of their religion and the capital, the former capital of their empire. And after Russia has taken Constantinople, then she comes with many ships and with chariots and with horsemen into the glorious land, verse 41. That's all, I think, well known amongst us. But look at the next detail. And many shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. So when the king of the north comes down into Israel, there is a power which is described as Edom, Moab and Ammon, which escape. So where was Edom? That's where Edom was, on the east side of the Dead Sea, fairly low down. That's where Edom was. And then he goes on, the king of the north, here in verse 43, into Egypt. So he goes on down into the territory of the king of the south. But Edom, on the east side of the Jordan River, is bypassed, and not attacked by the king of the north. So I believe that chapter requires there to be a latter-day power, which is described as Edom, and we'll see the reasons for that as we proceed, which is going to be in that same territory. So that's one passage. Now let's look at the other one, which is Isaiah, also chapter 11. One wonders at the thoughts of Isaiah as he pondered this after he'd written it. The prophets searched what manner of time the Spirit of Christ which was in them did testify, which spoke of these things. So, Isaiah 11, verse 10, the root of Jesse shall stand for an ensign of the people. To it shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest shall be glorious. So all the nations are going to go up to Jerusalem. And verse 11, it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people that shall be left out of all those countries. And verse 12, he shall set up an ensign for the nations and gather the outcasts of Israel. That's the 10 tribes. That's the second stick of Ezekiel 37. And so he'll assemble them out of the nations that he might judge them, as Ezekiel 20 describes, and gather together the dispersed of Judah. Why Judah dispersed? Because the king of the north of Daniel 11, Gog of Ezekiel 38, same power, have come into the land. And the Jews will flee. They will try and escape. Just as they did when Sennacherib came into the land in the days of Hezekiah. And then they were gathered together again. Kings shall be thy nursing fathers, says Isaiah, and queens thy nursing mothers. They shall bring thy sons in their arms and carry thy daughters upon their shoulders. So they're brought back. Verse 13. The envy also of Ephraim shall depart, and the adversaries of Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not envy Judah, and Judah shall not vex Ephraim. So this parallels the joining together of the two sticks in Ezekiel chapter 37. And there they are, Ephraim in the north and Judah in the south. Now join together and become one nation. And what do? Verse 14, they fly upon the shoulders of the Philistines toward the west. That's the Gaza Strip. That's the Palestinians. That's Hamas. And we'll look at the Hamas charter a little later. And Israel and Judah together, Ephraim and Judah together, fly upon them. And they shall spoil them of the east together. They shall lay their hand upon Edom and Moab, and the children of Ammon shall obey them. And they will conquer all that territory on the east side of the Dead Sea and the River Jordan, which will then be theirs and part of the land promised by God to Abraham. So again, Isaiah 11 is requiring that they shall be a power on the ancient territory of Edom, and the other passages that we've looked at, Ezekiel 35 and Obadiah and so forth, say that that power will have the same attitude toward the Jews as the descendants of Esau had toward the descendants of Jacob. So there's clearly an Edom there, where Edom always was, and it's in the latter days. So those two passages are telling us, particularly the Isaiah 11 passage is telling us, that some violently anti-Israel power must possess Mt Seir at the time of the end. And we've seen how rapidly the situation can change in the Middle East. We've seen the rise of ISIS. We've seen Russia suddenly go into Syria and do as she wills, and nobody can stop her. So who's in this territory now? Well, it's the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, ruled over by King Abdullah II, the son of King Hussein, and he is the son of the original Abdullah, who was put in charge of the kingdom of Transjordan, as it was known then, by the British in the 1920s, when they drew all those lines on the Middle Eastern map and divided up the Middle East and the Ottoman Empire post-World War I. So what's the situation in Jordan? Well, Abdullah is an astute king. He's managed to keep the lid on a cauldron, but Jordan is struggling to manage the rise of ISIS and other jihadist threats. It's simmering with social unrest. There was an incident in the papers yesterday where 3 Jordanian security men, 3 intelligence officers, were shot by somebody. They don't know who it was, but somebody found these guys and killed them. 13% of the population of Jordan are Syrian refugees who've fled the fighting in Syria. Another 13% of the population of Jordan are Egyptian and Palestinian refugees who have fled from Egypt, and the descendants of those who fled in 1948 across the Jordan when the Israeli War of Independence was taking place. And King Abdullah is managing to keep the lid on all this lot and get as much foreign aid as he can to make their lives as comfortable as possible so they don't rise up. But things could change very easily, and these scriptures that we're looking at are telling us that things must change to fulfill Bible prophecy. So, watch Jordan. So, Ezekiel 35, again, God is against this people because of specifically their attitude toward Israel. And we've noticed already that the address of the prophecy is to Mt Seir rather than Edom. In other words, it's geographic, it's about the territory rather than the people. And really, the attitude that's depicted there, verse 5 for example, thou hast had a perpetual hatred and hast shed the blood of the children of Israel by the force of the sword in the time of their calamity. That attitude is mirrored in the attitude which we see in Palestine peoples today. So there, for example, is the Hamas Charter, drawn up in 1988. Well, that's a little bit of it, it's a huge document. The day that enemies usurp part of Muslim land, jihad becomes the individual duty of every Muslim. In the face of the Jews' usurpation of Palestine, it is compulsory that the banner of jihad be raised. To do this requires the diffusion of Islamic consciousness among the masses, both on the regional, Arab and Islamic levels. It is necessary to instill the spirit of jihad in the heart of the nation so that they would confront the enemies and join the ranks of the fighters. Jews have taken over part of Muslim land as they see it. We've got to fight against them. We've got to wage war against them. That's the attitude of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and we've already seen in Isaiah chapter 14 that Ephraim and Judah together will spoil them in the west. But let's now turn to Joel chapter 3. And Joel chapter 3, at the end of the chapter, singles out Edom because of their extreme violence. Joel chapter 3 and verse 16. Let's go back for the context. Yahweh will roar out of Zion. I believe that the return of Christ actually occurs between verses 15 and 16 of Joel chapter 3. Yahweh shall roar out of Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem. The heavens and the earth shall shake. Here's the great earthquake of Ezekiel 38. But Yahweh will be the hope of his people and the strength of the children of Israel. And it goes on to talk about Zion, his holy mountain, and all the blessings upon Judah and the fountain out of the house of Yahweh. But now verse 19. Egypt shall be a desolation, and Edom shall be a desolate wilderness for the violence against the children of Judah, because they have shed innocent blood in their land. But Judah shall dwell forever, and Jerusalem from generation to generation. So in Ezekiel 35, verses 6 to 10, which we've looked at, God is recompensing them for the evil that they have done to Israel in the time of Israel's deliverance, in the time that their iniquity has an end. And notice the reference to two nations, two countries. We're going to meet this obviously later on in chapter 37 in the parable of the two sticks. But Ezekiel 35 verse 11. Therefore, as I live, saith the Lord Yahweh, I will even do according to thine anger and according to thine envy, which thou hast used out of thy hatred against them. And I will make myself known among them when I have judged thee. So God's actions are proportionate. You have demonstrated this attitude toward Israel, therefore I will pour out these judgments upon you. Turn back to Ezekiel chapter 18. And here we have the principle of God's dealings with men. Ezekiel 18 and verse 20. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. The son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him. But if the wicked will turn from all his sins that he hath committed, and keep all my statutes, and do that which is lawful and right, he shall surely live, he shall not die. All his transgressions that he hath committed, they shall not be mentioned unto him. In his righteousness that he hath done, he shall live. Have I any pleasure at all that the wicked should die, saith the Lord Yahweh, and not that he should return from his ways and live? But when the righteous turneth away from his righteousness, and committeth iniquity, and doeth according to all the abominations that the wicked man doeth, shall he live? All his righteousness that he hath done shall not be mentioned. In his trespass that he hath trespassed, and in his sin that he hath sinned, in them shall he die. And that's true for all of us. God's response to our lives is proportionate. We commit wickedness, we must expect his judgment. If we seek to live righteously before him, he will bless us. And it's exactly the same principle which God will exercise toward Edom in the latter days. Now, there's no doubt that Edom is going to be judged. Ezekiel 25 now, and verse 12. Ezekiel 25 and verse 12. And I will lay my vengeance upon Edom by the hand of my people Israel. That's exactly what we saw in Isaiah chapter 11 verse 14. And they shall do in Edom according to mine anger and according to my fury, and they shall know my vengeance, saith the Lord Yahweh. So God's going to use Israel as his instrument to punish Edom. And incidentally, in the last three verses of Ezekiel 25, there we've got punishment upon the Philistines. They of the west, the Gaza Strip, the Palestinians of today, who are trying to claim, incidentally, they're actually descended from the ancient Philistines, so they're bringing the wrath of God upon them in doing that. And Obadiah does exactly the same thing. Sorry to ask you to find Obadiah twice in one class, but we need to go back there for the final section of Obadiah. We've seen in the early part of the prophecy through Obadiah the attitude of this people of Edom. Now we go to the final section, which I find very exciting. First of all, just have a look at United Nations Resolution 181, the original resolution of November 1947, which decided to partition the land of Palestine between Jewish and Arab territories. And that, of course, echoes Joel chapter 3. They have parted my land. And the UN drew up maps which showed which bits were Arab and which bits were Jewish. But then came the 1948 War of Independence, and the map that resulted out of the War of Independence in 1948 was a very different map to the maps that the UN had drawn up. Israel had rather more territory than the UN was willing to allocate to them. And then, of course, came the Six-Day War in 1967. So the light-coloured area is the area that Israel managed to hold on to and wrest from the Arabs in 1948. And then in 1967 they took the Gaza Strip and they took the West Bank, and of course they took Golan up here. And UN Resolution 267 demanded, this was post-1967, that they return to the 1948 border. Ariel Sharon, 2005, said, OK, they can have the Gaza Strip. Let's see what sort of state they make out of it. And, well, the world has seen it. But the pressure is on Israel to give up the Golan Heights up there and all this West Bank territory on which they're constantly building settlements. So let's now look at Obadiah. Verse 17. But upon Mount Zion shall be deliverance, and there shall be holiness, and the house of Jacob shall possess their possessions. And the house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau for stubble. And they shall kindle in them and devour them, and there shall not be any remaining of the house of Esau, for Yahweh hath spoken it. So there's a reference to Israel, again, being God's battle axe and weapon of war against the house of Esau. But now look in detail at verses 19 and 20. And this really is quite amazing. So there's the borders, 1948 borders, plus the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Israel have given up the Gaza Strip. They're under pressure to give up the West Bank. So look at this now. And they of the south shall possess the Mount of Esau. There we are, the Mount of Esau, down there, Mt Seir in the south. And they of the plain, the Philistines, the Gaza Strip. And they shall possess the fields of Ephraim and the fields of Samaria. That's the West Bank. And Benjamin shall possess Gilead. That's up there in the northeast territory, which was, of course, occupied by the 2.5 tribes in the time of Israel's kingdom, but which has never been occupied by modern Israel. But Zechariah 10 tells us that when Ephraim comes back, that's part of the territory that they'll be settled in. Benjamin shall possess Gilead. Verse 20, and the captivity of this host of the children of Israel shall possess that of the Canaanites, even unto Zarephath. So that's up in Lebanon, in the north, which Israel have been briefly into and pulled out of again. Don't have now. And the captivity of Jerusalem, which is in Sepharad, shall possess the cities of the south, the Negev, which Israel completely took over in 1967, but gave most of it back to Egypt. So it's remarkable that geographical description there in those 2 verses in Obadiah parallel other passages of Scripture and show how Israel is going to break out of the territory that they've been constrained into by world opinion to possess the land which God promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And we're almost there, brothers and sisters. Look at the next verse, verse 21. And saviours shall come up upon Mount Zion to judge the Mount of Esau, and the kingdom shall be Yahweh's. So these verses here at the end of Obadiah parallel the last verses of Ezekiel chapter 35. Let's go back there in conclusion. Ezekiel 35 and verse 14. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, when the whole earth rejoiceth, I will make thee desolate. As thou didst rejoice at the inheritance of the house of Israel, because it was desolate, so will I do unto thee. Thou shalt be desolate, O Mount Seir, and all Idumea, even all of it, and they shall know that I am Yahweh. And so we await the time, brothers and sisters, young people, when the whole earth will rejoice in the goodness of God. When we will be there as saviours upon the Mount Zion with the Lord Jesus Christ. This is the great climax which Ezekiel 35 leads us to, and which I believe all these other visions in Ezekiel's prophecy, 36, 37, 38, 39, lead us to also.